The moving truck was already backed into the driveway. I remember staring at it from the front porch, still in my work clothes, my badge from the diner clipped to my shirt, wondering whose it was, until my mother stepped outside holding my suitcase, the same faded blue one I'd used since I was 14, and said, "You have 1 hour." I already made my decision. I choose your sister. Have you ever stood in the doorway of the only home you've ever known and watched your own mother hand you your life in a single bag? Because I did, on a Tuesday evening in late October 3 years ago, when the leaves were just starting to turn brown and curl at the edges, the same way something inside me curled up and died the moment she said those words. My name is Rachel, and for 26 years I believed that if I just worked hard enough, loved hard enough, and never once complained, my mother would eventually see me the way she saw my younger sister, Ashley. I know now how naive that sounds. But growing up, hope is a hard habit to break, especially when it's the only thing keeping you upright. My father died when I was 15. A construction accident, the kind of thing that gets a paragraph in the local paper and then gets forgotten by everyone except the people who loved him. I remember my mother sitting at the kitchen table for 3 days straight after the funeral, not eating, just staring at his coffee mug like it might somehow bring him back if she looked at it long enough. Ashley was 11 then, too young to really carry any of the weight, so I carried it for both of us. I dropped out of the honors track at school and picked up shifts at the diner on Route 9 after classes. I learned how to read utility bills and negotiate payment plans before I learned how to drive. I became, without ever being asked, the adult in a house that had lost its only other one. My mother never really recovered. Grief did something to her, hardened parts of her that used to be soft, and somewhere in those years she made a decision I don't think she ever consciously admitted to herself, that Ashley was the daughter she needed to protect, and I was the daughter she could lean on. There's a cruelty in that distinction that took me years to understand, because on the surface it looked like trust. People would say, "Rachel's so responsible, so mature for her age," and I wore it like a badge of honor, not realizing it was actually a cage. Responsible meant I didn't get to be fragile. Mature meant nobody worried about me. Ashley got to cry and be held. I got told to be strong because someone had to be. By the time I was 19, I was covering half the mortgage on our house with tips and diner wages while going to community college part-time, one class at a semester because that was all I could afford after the bills were paid. Ashley, at 15, was getting her nails done for homecoming and asking my mother for a car for her 16th birthday. And here's the thing that still sits like a stone in my chest when I think about it. My mother said yes. Not because we had the money, we didn't, but because she took out a loan against the house without telling me, using equity that, unbeknownst to me at the time, technically included my father's portion, which by law should have eventually been split between his children. I didn't find that out until much later. Back then, I just knew there was suddenly a black Honda Civic in the driveway with a bow on it, and I was the one who'd spent that same week working a double shift on my birthday because we couldn't afford to close the diner even for an hour. I want to be clear about something because I think it's important, and because if you're watching this and you've lived something similar, you'll understand why I need to say it. I didn't hate my sister. I loved her. I still do, somewhere underneath everything that happened. She wasn't a villain out of some fairy tale, twirling a mustache and plotting my downfall. She was a product of the same broken system I was, just on the other end of it. She was spoiled because she was allowed to be, and I was hardened because I wasn't allowed to be anything else. I was working 2 jobs by then, the diner during the day, and evenings doing bookkeeping for a small accounting firm downtown, a job I'd landed because the owner, a kind older man named Mr. Whitfield, saw something in me during an interview I almost didn't get because I showed up in my diner uniform, having had no time to change. He taught me things nobody in my family ever thought to teach me: how to read a balance sheet, how compound interest worked, how a person could build wealth slowly and quietly if they were patient and disciplined. I started saving. Not much, but consistently, the way you're supposed to when you're trying to build something out of nothing. I kept paying half the mortgage. I kept buying groceries when the fridge ran empty 2 weeks before my mother's disability check came in. I kept showing up. Ashley, meanwhile, dropped out of her second semester of college, a college my mother had somehow found the money to send her to, though I never saw a single loan document or scholarship letter to explain how, and moved back home. She didn't get a job. She said she was figuring things out. My mother let her figure things out for 2 years, during which I never once heard the words, "When are you going to contribute?" directed at my sister, despite hearing some version of "you should be doing more" directed at me on what felt like a weekly basis. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself my worth wasn't measured in my mother's approval, that I was building something real for myself regardless of whether she noticed. I threw myself into work. I got promoted at the accounting firm to a junior bookkeeper role with actual benefits. I started taking 2 online business classes a semester instead of 1. I was, by every external measure, doing well. And I think looking back, that's exactly what made my mother uncomfortable. Because somewhere in the last year before everything fell apart, Ashley, now 22, unemployed, dating a man named Derek who my mother adored despite the fact that he'd been fired from 3 separate jobs for what he called personality conflicts, got pregnant. I remember the night my mother told me, sitting across from me at that same kitchen table my father used to sit at, wringing her hands the way she did when she was building up to something difficult. She said Ashley and Derek needed to move into the house permanently. She said the baby needed stability. She said family takes care of family. I agreed. Of course I agreed. What kind of person wouldn't want to help their sister and a baby on the way? I offered to switch to the smaller bedroom, the one that used to be my father's home office, so Ashley and Derek could have the bigger room for a nursery down the line. I offered to increase my contribution to the mortgage to cover Derek not having steady work. I did everything I could think of to make the transition smooth because that's who I'd always been in that family, the one who made things easier for everyone else. 3 months later, the baby was born. A little boy named Wyatt, and God, I loved him instantly. The way you love a piece of your family you didn't know you were missing. I babysat for free whenever Ashley and Derek needed a break, which, if I'm honest, was most weekends. I bought him clothes with money I should have been saving. I told myself this was what family meant, that love isn't a ledger, that you give because you love, not because you expect anything back. But somewhere in those months, something shifted in the house that I didn't fully register until it was too late. Derek started talking about, when this becomes our place, referring to a house that wasn't his, that wasn't even fully my mother's, given that part of it legally still belonged to my father's estate, which meant, whether anyone in that house wanted to admit it or not, it belonged partly to me and Ashley both. My mother started talking about making room and simplifying things and how the house really only needs 1 working adult paying in, since Derek's about to start a new position. A position that, as far as I could tell, never actually materialized. And Ashley, my little sister, who I had fed and clothed and stayed up late comforting through breakups since she was 11 years old, started looking at me the way you look at furniture you're thinking about replacing. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I'd worked a double at the diner because someone called in sick, then gone straight to the accounting firm for 4 more hours, and I came home past 9, exhausted, my feet aching in a way that had become so familiar I barely registered it anymore. And there was a moving truck in the driveway. I thought, at first, that maybe Ashley and Derek had finally found their own place, and something in me, despite everything, felt a small flicker of hope. Relief, even. Maybe things could go back to something resembling normal. But then I saw my mother on the porch, holding my suitcase. "What's going on?" I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "We need the space, Rachel," she said. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "This is hard for me too." Just a statement of fact, delivered with a flat, practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this in her head many times before saying it out loud. Derek's cousin is going to help him get steady work if he moves in too, and with the baby, we just don't have room for 3 working schedules and everyone underfoot. You're the one with the most going for you right now. You'll land on your feet. You always do. You always do. As if my entire life's function had been to demonstrate resilience so that everyone else could be fragile in peace. "This is my house too," I said, And I heard my own voice shake, because some part of me already knew what I was about to say wouldn't matter. Dad's part of this house is mine and Ashley's. You can't just. I've already made my decision, my mother said, cutting me off, and there was something in her eyes that I will never forget. Not cruelty exactly, but a kind of exhausted finality, like she'd already grieved the decision and moved past it long before she ever told me. I choose your sister. She has a baby, Rachel. She needs stability. You have options. You have 1 hour. I stood on that porch for what felt like an hour by itself, just absorbing the sentence, watching Derek's cousin carry a box of my sister's shoes past me like I was already invisible, already gone. And then something in me, the part that had spent 11 years being strong so nobody else had to be, simply stopped functioning the way it always had. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I went inside, packed what I could into 2 duffel bags and that same blue suitcase, took the folder of financial documents I'd kept in my closet since I started contributing to the mortgage, the folder with every receipt, every bank transfer, every proof of every dollar I'd poured into a house that had just told me, in the clearest language possible, that I did not belong in it. And I left. I spent that first night in my car in the parking lot of the accounting firm, because I didn't yet have anywhere else to go and I was too proud, or maybe too shattered, to call anyone and admit what had just happened. I remember looking at myself in the rearview mirror around 2 a.m, mascara smudged from crying silently for hours after I'd finally let myself feel it, and thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, I am done building a life for people who see me as furniture. I called Mr. Whitfield the next morning, not to ask for money, but because he was the only adult in my life who had ever actually believed in me without expecting anything back. He didn't ask many questions. He just told me his sister-in-law had a spare room she rented out cheap near downtown, and he'd make a call. Within a week I had a place, small and a little run down, but mine, with a door that locked and a name on the lease that was only my own for the first time in my life. I want to tell you that the anger came first, but it didn't. Grief came first, a slow, suffocating grief for a mother I'd spent my whole life trying to earn, and for a version of my family that I finally understood had never really existed the way I'd needed it to. I grieved for months. I went to work, I came home, I cried in a shower with bad water pressure, and I told almost no one, because shame has a way of making you protect the people who hurt you, even after they've stopped deserving it. But grief, if you let it move through you instead of around you, eventually turns into something else. For me, it turned into focus. I remember the exact night it happened, about 2 months after I left, sitting on the floor of my rented room, because I hadn't bought furniture yet, going through that folder of financial documents I'd grabbed on my way out. Not out of some grand strategic plan, at first just because I needed to understand my own life, needed proof on paper that I hadn't imagined the years of sacrifice, that I wasn't crazy for feeling used. And as I went through them, something started to take shape that I hadn't fully processed before. My father's will, a document I'd read once at 17 and then tucked away, too young and too grief-stricken to understand its actual weight, stated clearly that his portion of the house was to be held in trust for his 2 daughters, to be distributed either when we turned 25 or upon our mother's remarriage, or the sale of the property, whichever came first. My mother had never remarried, but 3 years before I was thrown out, she had refinanced the house, using paperwork that, as far as I could find, never once mentioned my name or Ashley's, despite the trust clause requiring both signatures for any refinancing action that altered the ownership structure of the property. I wasn't a lawyer. I didn't fully understand the implications that night, but I understood enough to know that something about that refinance didn't add up, and for the first time since I'd left that porch with a suitcase in my hand, I felt something other than grief. I felt purpose. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because this isn't a story about magic or fantasy or some dramatic courtroom scene ripped from a movie. It's a story about patience and about doing the quiet, unglamorous work of building a case, not for revenge, not at first, but simply for the truth. I used part of my savings, The money I'd been putting aside for years without ever quite knowing what it was for, to consult with a real estate attorney named Diane Cho, a woman Mr. Whitfield's firm had worked with before on estate matters. I brought her everything: the will, the refinance documents I was able to pull from public county records, my years of mortgage payment receipts, bank statements showing the money I'd contributed. I remember sitting in her office, my hands shaking slightly as I laid it all out, half expecting her to tell me I was chasing something that didn't exist. Instead, she looked through the documents for a long time, and then she looked up at me and said, "Rachel, do you understand what you're sitting on here?" Diane and I built the case slowly over the following year. I kept working, kept saving, kept building my own life quietly in the background. I'd moved up at the accounting firm to a role handling small business clients directly, and I'd started taking my business degree seriously, finishing it faster than I'd expected because for the first time, I was doing it for myself, not to prove anything to anyone. I dated a little, made a few real friends, people who knew nothing about the house or the trust or any of it, people who just knew me as Rachel, the woman who worked hard and laughed easily once you got to know her and never talked about her family much. It was, strangely, one of the most peaceful years of my life, even while a legal case quietly built in the background like a slow-burning fuse. During that time, I heard bits and pieces about what was happening at the house, mostly through mutual friends or the occasional stilted text from my mother that I answered, but never elaborated on. Derek's promised steady work never fully materialized. He cycled through 2 more jobs and eventually stopped looking altogether. Ashley, without me there to quietly absorb the financial gaps the way I always had, without me picking up double shifts to cover months when the mortgage payment came up short, found herself and my mother struggling in ways the household hadn't struggled in years, because as it turned out, my contributions hadn't just been generous, they'd been load-bearing. I heard, through my cousin Melissa, that they'd fallen behind on payments twice, that Derek's cousin's situation had fallen through, that the house that once felt so urgently in need of space now felt, according to my mother in a rare, unguarded moment on the phone, harder to manage than we expected. I felt something complicated hearing that. Not joy exactly. I want to be honest, because I think pretending I felt nothing but noble indifference would be a lie, and this story only means something if I tell it truthfully. There was a small, sharp satisfaction in knowing the walls I'd been holding up without anyone noticing had started to lean without me there. But mostly I felt sad. Sad that it had taken my absence for anyone to understand what my presence had actually been worth. The letter went out on a spring morning almost exactly 2 years after I left that porch. I remember the date because it was also the anniversary of my father's death, which Diane hadn't planned but which felt, to me, like something closer to intention than coincidence. It was a formal legal notice, drafted by Diane's firm, informing my mother that the 2019 refinance of the property violated the terms of my father's testamentary trust, that as beneficiaries, Ashley and I had standing to challenge the refinance and potentially force a review of the property's ownership structure, and that we were prepared to pursue mediation and litigation if necessary, to resolve the matter according to the original terms of the trust. I found out later from Melissa that my mother read that letter standing in the kitchen and that she had to sit down halfway through it. I didn't do this to take the house from her. I want to be completely clear about that because I think it's the single most important part of the story. I asked Diane to structure our position not around forcing a sale or forcing my mother out, but around forcing acknowledgement, a formal, legal restructuring of the property that recognized my and Ashley's actual ownership stake, established my mother's right to remain in the home for as long as she needed, but also established, in writing, that any future decisions about that house, decisions like who gets to live there and who gets an hour to pack a suitcase, would legally require my signature going forward for the rest of my life. My mother called me the day after the letter arrived. I almost didn't answer. I remember staring at her name on my phone screen for the entire duration of the ring, feeling my heart pound in a way it hadn't in over a year, and then I picked up because avoiding her forever had never been the goal. understandingless. She was crying before she even said hello properly. She asked how I could do this to her, and for a moment, old instincts flared up in me. The instinct to soothe her, to apologize, to make myself smaller so she could feel comfortable again. But I thought about that porch. I thought about the suitcase. I thought about 11 years of double shifts and skipped birthdays and a black Honda Civic that should have been mine as much as Ashley's. And I said calmly, "You had 1 hour to decide, Mom. I'm giving you as much time as you need to understand this isn't revenge. It's just the truth, finally written down where nobody can erase it." There was a long silence on the line, and then she said something I've turned over in my mind 1,000 times since. She said, "I didn't think you'd ever fight back. You were always the one who just handled things." That sentence broke something open in me, because it confirmed what I'd always suspected but never had the language for, that my entire worth in that household had been measured by my willingness to absorb, to accommodate, to disappear my own needs so everyone else's could be met. And the moment I stopped disappearing, it registered to her as an attack, rather than as the first honest thing I'd done in years. We didn't go to court. Diane had told me that was likely, given how clearly the paperwork favored our position, and given that my mother, to her credit, once she understood the reality of what she was facing, chose not to fight a battle she was unlikely to win, and that would have cost more in legal fees than the dispute itself. Instead, we went through mediation. It took 4 months. It was not warm, and it was not easy, but it was honest in a way that nothing in my family had been honest in years. The final agreement restructured the deed to reflect the trust's original terms. My mother retained the right to live in the house. Ashley and I were formally recognized as co-beneficiaries of my father's portion of the equity, meaning that any future refinancing, any future sale, any future major decision about that house required both of our signatures, not just my mother's. It wasn't about money for me, though there was a financial component, a modest but meaningful sum reflecting the years of contributions I'd made that had never been formally acknowledged. It was about the simple, quiet fact that nobody in that house could ever again decide, unilaterally, in the span of a single hour, that I didn't belong there. I didn't move back in. People sometimes ask me that, expecting some triumphant homecoming scene, and I understand why. It would make for a tidier ending. But that house had stopped being home to me long before I left it, and no amount of legal paperwork could undo that. What the agreement gave me wasn't a bedroom. It was proof. Proof that I mattered, written in the kind of ink that doesn't fade, filed in the kind of records that don't disappear just because someone decides they're inconvenient. Ashley and I didn't speak for almost a year after the mediation. I think she felt, understandably, caught in the middle of something that was never really about her, even though her name was on some of the documents too. When we finally did talk, it was at a coffee shop halfway between our two lives, and she cried almost the entire time, apologizing not just for the eviction, which she said she hadn't fully agreed with but also hadn't fought against, but for years of taking for granted a sister who never once, not one single time, made her feel like a burden, even when she probably should have. I forgave her. Not immediately and not completely, but genuinely, because I understood by then that she had been shaped by the same broken system I had, just from the other direction. We're not as close as sisters in movies, the kind who talk every day and finish each other's sentences. But we talk. We see each other on holidays on our own terms now, not because either of us is required to perform a version of family that never really existed the way it should have. My relationship with my mother is the most complicated part of the story, and I won't pretend it has a clean resolution, because real life rarely does. We talk occasionally. She's never fully apologized, not in the way I think I once needed her to, though I've come to accept that some people simply aren't capable of that particular kind of honesty, especially about the ways they've failed the people who loved them most. What she has done in small, halting ways over the past year is start to see me, really see me for maybe the first time since my father died. She asks about my job now. She remembered my birthday this year, called instead of texting, and stayed on the phone for almost 20 minutes, which might not sound like much, but for us, it was practically a monument. I think about that porch a lot, still. The suitcase. The hour. The way her voice sounded when she said, "I choose your sister." Like it was the simplest decision in the world. Like I was a line item. She was crossing off a budget rather than a daughter she was choosing to lose. I used to think that moment was the worst thing that ever happened to me. I've come to understand it differently now. It was the moment I stopped waiting for permission to matter and started building a life where my own judgment of my worth was the only one that actually counted. I own my own place now, a small but sunlit one-bedroom I closed on 8 months ago, entirely on my own name, my own credit, my own years of quiet, unglamorous saving. I got promoted again at the firm. I manage a small portfolio of business clients now, people who remind me a little of myself at 19, scrappy and underestimated, and hungry to prove something to a world that hadn't yet learned to see them. I babysit Wyatt sometimes still, on my terms now, and he's 4 and he doesn't know any of this history, and I hope he never has to learn the particular lesson I learned on that porch, that love, real love, doesn't come with an hour-long deadline attached. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's not the legal maneuvering, though I know some of you watching this are probably wondering about trust documents and refinance clauses, and I'm happy to talk about the mechanics of it in the comments if that's useful to you. The thing I actually want you to take is simpler than that. Somewhere out there, someone is being told, in ways loud or quiet, obvious or subtle, that they matter less than someone else in their own family. And I need you to hear this the way I wish someone had told me years earlier. Being the strong one is not the same as being the loved one, and you are allowed to stop proving your worth to people who only notice you when you stop being useful to them. You are allowed to build a life so solid, so entirely your own, that nobody can ever again fit your entire existence into the span of a single hour. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because sometimes, justice really does win.